Okay, everybody, welcome back. So good to be with you guys as usual. I hope everybody's doing really well and um, everything's been going smooth since the last time you checked into the lectures. And here we are for part two of our three-part lecture series on the religion of Buddhism. Um, so we're continuing on our current course in this topic, the major world religion of Buddhism. Last time we got started with the first installment of this lecture series on Buddhism. And in that lecture, we gave a general introduction to Buddhism, as well as a detailed summary of its origins and the subsequent historical development of the tradition. We learned, so just I'm going to summarize a few of the things from the previous meeting to get us sort of started here. But we learned about the founding father of Buddhism, the Indian prince named Siddhartha Gautama, who lived in northern India in the 6th and 5th century BCE. We learned about how he abandoned his privileged life and identity to become a wanderer in search of enlightenment and liberation from samsara, the cycle of the perpetual cycle of birth, death, and reincarnation. After escaping the palace walls, he saw four notable sights: a sick man, an old man, a dead person, and a wandering mystic. And later, under the Bodhi tree at Bodh Gaya, he attains nirvana and dedicates the rest of his life to instructing others in how to reach that state. Um, he basically spread the message of the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path. His disciples and followers grew, and he spread his message to them. After his death, councils were convened to set down his teachings and the rules for monks and Buddhist lay people to follow in the community. Buddhism then ends up spreading far through the patronage of royalty and emperors that are either Buddhists themselves, like the 3rd century BCE Indian king Ashoka, who spread it to Sri Lanka and from there Southeast Asia, or at least leaders and authorities that were tolerant of the religion. Um, Also, traveling monks influenced Asian lands through trade routes they passed through, and also monasteries were developed through secular state sponsorship and the Buddhist community. This causes Buddhism to flourish and spread far beyond its origins in India, throughout Asia, in countries like China, Korea, Japan, Tibet, Nepal, Myanmar, Thailand, and Vietnam. In India, it grew up until the late medieval period of the 12th century, when it was both being eclipsed by the dominant Hindu tradition of India, but also being suppressed by invading armies bent on persecuting the royal patrons of Buddhism that they were at war against, and therefore they destroyed many monasteries that had been established in India at that time. We also discussed last time in broad outlines some of the different sects of Buddhism, including the Mahayana school, which prevails in China, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, the offshoot of Mahayana called Tantric Buddhism, which dominates in Tibet and Nepal, and Theravada Buddhism, which is the majority of Southeast Asian nations like Thailand and Myanmar. So today, in the second installment of this lecture series on Buddhism, we'll continue our exploration of the religion by having an in-depth discussion of these points. So here are some of the key elements discussed today. I'm just putting them in the chat area. Aspects of the divine. So we're going to learn about aspects of the divine, which will show how Buddhists honor and revere the Buddha, but also the other celestial Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. We'll then go into the important sacred texts of the religion. Sacred texts, the canonical writings that different Buddhists use to structure their practices and traditions. After that, we'll review the various sacred persons. Sacred persons, important monks and Buddhist saints and scholars that helped advance the religion. And then we'll finish today's lesson by explaining the basic ethical principles and moral beliefs of Buddhism as well. We have these four major topics of discussion and summary to explain today. So let's begin then today's material by starting with aspects of the divine that we find in the Buddhist religion. So Theravada Buddhists regard the Buddha as a human being, not a god, and that's the general view of all different Buddhist sects, really. He's just a man that achieved nirvana. In the Theravada tradition, making an offering to Buddha's image is not thought of as worshiping a god. Instead, it's just done to achieve positive karma and to celebrate his life and wisdom. it's kind of like how if you visited the grave of a loved one, you're not, making a worshiping of God or paying homage to a divine being, but you're reflecting on the person's life and their teachings and drawing inspiration from that can kind of guide you through your own life. But there are some forms of Buddhism which include things, if even if not Buddha himself, but they include the idea that there are things that somewhat resemble divine beings that one can pray to, or that can confer grace and prosperity on a person. I mean, I guess they would say the Buddha himself is one of these bodhisattvas. In the Mahayana tradition of Buddhism, there is the belief that certain people who are so far along the path to becoming a Buddha that they do attain the status of bodhisattva, which means future Buddha. So I guess they would have seen the Buddha himself as a bodhisattva up until the time that he achieved his final nirvana in the Mahayana tradition. But the bodhisattva, their many good deeds of compassion and wisdom caused them to become almost like gods. They endure after their death in a celestial realm, where they're then called celestial bodhisattvas. So I just put in the note celestial bodhisattvas, figures who endure in a celestial realm after death to help bring grace and enlightenment to others. So these are people who are far along a path towards their own Buddhahood, and they choose to sort of remain suspended in this realm of the celestial realm where they can then exert an influence on people. People can petition to them, sort of pray to them, and they confer both grace and also help people along the path to their own enlightenment. So they endure in a celestial realm, and Mahayana Buddhists believe that from this state they can miraculously intervene into the events of the world, benefiting people through their grace. So the Mahayana tradition, more so than the Theravada tradition, holds at least the idea of some kind of mystical or spiritual beings, although they're derived from actual human beings that have made progress towards being a Buddha and then endure in the realm afterwards as these bodhisattvas. At the end of their career as a celestial bodhisattva, they can then become celestial Buddhas, which give them even greater miraculous powers. But the tradition holds that they will often delay the movement to becoming a celestial Buddha to provide more time to assist others on their path to enlightenment first. So the celestial Buddhas are fully enlightened, the celestial bodhisattvas are almost there, and they linger in the celestial realm for a while so that they can provide help. But once they become the Buddhas, then their cycle of reincarnation and existence ceases, so then they can no longer exert an influence. For that reason, according to the tradition of Mahayana, many celestial bodhisattvas will delay the ultimate achievement of their own nirvana so that they can spend more time bringing other people up and helping them as well. So given the belief in the celestial Buddhas and bodhisattvas, Mahayana Buddhism has developed a whole collection of these quasi-divine figures. So let me just mention a few of the notable divine figures that are talked about in the Mahayana tradition that are these celestial Buddhas and bodhisattvas. Notable among this group is the bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. So okay, Avalokiteshvara is known as the Lord who looks down. He's often personified as a Buddha with a compassionate gaze cast downward, and he's supposed to signify the compassionate gaze of the Buddha himself. He has the title of the Lord who looks down because he's described as one who looks down on the world from a position on high, feeling its suffering, having compassion, and trying to protect and help people from his, celestial position. This bodhisattva has been portrayed different in different Buddhist cultures. In India, he has become associated with a female bodhisattva, so I should say she, named Tara. So in India, Avalokiteshvara has been known as Tara, a symbol of more feminine compassion. In China, the same bodhisattva is worshipped under the name Guanyin. So let me just give some of these names. Okay, so Tara is the feminine version of this bodhisattva, as they're referring to it in India. And then the Chinese iteration of the same is Guanyin. Sorry, the Chinese iteration is sort of a composite of masculine and feminine aspects. So in China, it's worshipped under the name Guanyin, and it's seen as a composite of both male and female form, but mostly worshipped in a more female or feminine form. Tibetan Buddhists called the same bodhisattva by the name of Chenrezig. So giving you that as well. Just getting all the facts here listed out in my notes for you guys. Thanks for your patience. Yeah, so Tibetan Buddhists call it by the name of Chenrezig and claim that he has made a promise to protect Tibet. And they also believe that this bodhisattva is manifested in each new Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama is the sort of secular and religious leader of Tibet. So they believe that he kind of takes on the personage or the energy, etc., of Chenrezig. Other notable celestial bodhisattvas include Maitreya, who's known as the Buddha of the future age. So here's another one of these bodhisattvas. Maitreya is known as the Buddha of the future age, called this because he's believed to be the next bodhisattva who will enter the world and become the next Buddha. So whoever's up next in terms of the patronage and lineage of Buddhas will be Maitreya, Buddha of the future age. He's also said to be able to rescue people from trouble or from, tough predicaments people may find themselves in. So he's kind of also petitioned and prayed to for those reasons. In China, this Buddha, Maitreya, is known as Milfo. Fo is the word for Buddha in Chinese. So this is the Chinese name of Maitreya. And some sects have sometimes claimed that he's akin to a Messiah figure, as we've seen in some of the Abrahamic religions. Since he's the Buddha of the future age, talked about as someone who will come later, some in Chinese sects of Buddhism look at him as a Messiah figure that will enter the world someday and transform it into a Buddhist structured world. Another is Manjushri, the Bodhisattva of wisdom. Bodhisattva of wisdom. There's a sorry, I meant to say Shitagarbha. Some of these are kind of hard to pronounce because they're coming from either Thai or Tibetan translations. So please forgive some of the difficulties of clear pronunciation on some of it. So I'm just writing the information about this bodhisattva. Shitagarbha consoles the dead and protects travelers, pilgrims, and children. So that's the designated role of this bodhisattva. Perhaps the most well-known, though, of all the celestial bodhisattvas is Amitabha, which means infinite light. Chitagarbha for the previous one. I kept stumbling over the last two syllables. But anyway, Amitabha means infinite light. Some Buddhists believe that when Amitabha became a Buddha, he created a paradise called the Pure Land. So okay, so to those that follow the tradition, some Mahayana Buddhists believe that Amitabha has created a celestial paradise called the Pure Land. And to those who believe in it, they say that if you chant his name with a sincere belief in him at the moment of your death, that you'll be reborn in the Pure Land and be in the presence of Amitabha. So this is almost kind of like a corollary to Christian or Islamic ideas of a heavenly paradise, which is typically not the spiritual goal of most Buddhist practice. But at least the Pure Land Buddhists, as they're called, the sect of Mahayana, hold this idea. This figure is a prominent part of Chinese and Japanese Buddhism, where he goes by different names. So in China, the name of this Amitabha is Amituo Fo. Okay, so Amituo Fo is the Chinese name of Amitabha. And in Japan, he's also got a different designation, Mitabutsu. And that's the Japanese name. Okay. So he's important in the Mahayana traditions of China and Japan. This figure shows some semblance of the belief in Buddhism and of a kind of divine figure that grants a blissful afterlife, as I was saying, somewhat on par with Christianity or Islam's ideas of the same. To some devoted followers of Amitabha, it's believed that relying on him can result in enlightenment as much as or even more than one's own efforts. So he's also kind of able to exert the influence of salvation over somebody through his grace in a way that often is distinct from how many Buddhists believe that it's your own pursuit of enlightenment that leads you to that destination. There's also Baishajya Guru. And that is the Dr. Bodhisattva. So he's believed to be the teacher of healing. That's his role in the tradition and lore. He deals with medicine and being a physician. And then there's also Vairochana, which is the Sun Buddha. He's identified with the radiance and light of the sun and its warmth and healing and growth properties. Vairochana is often pictured at the center of Tantric Buddhist mandalas, these sacred circle artworks. So a mandala sacred circle artwork of Tantric Buddhists. That's the mandala. They're elaborate drawings that depict the totality of the universe and the individual's position within it with their mind and body. They're used in ritual practices and meditative practices for Tantric Buddhists. They're supposed to induce a sense of the vision of the unity of all things and to focus the person's mind on the relationship between the individual and the universe. If you'd like to see a quick image of that, again, this is my book, so it's maybe not the best resolution, but as I'm putting it up close to the camera, you can see this is a mandala with Vairochana shown at the center and a whole range of other bodhisattvas and human beings in concentric circles outside of it. So that's the way the mandalas typically look, and they're supposed to be an aid and a resource to help people meditate and practice Buddhist progress towards enlightenment. So now we've discussed the Buddhist views of divinity, or at least quasi-divine figures. That means that we're ready to move on to the next element of today's lesson, which is the important sacred texts of the religion. So, as we noted, when the Buddha died, the first Buddhist council was assembled to canonize and make more official the Buddhist teachings and ideas. They created, the monks and followers of the Buddha created a system of memorization and recitation of Buddhist doctrine, not much different than how in Islam, Judaism, and Hinduism it's considered significant and valuable to have the ability to orally recite basic doctrines of scripture. So we see that as well in at least the early oral transmission of Buddhist ideas. For 5 centuries after his death, this is how the canon was transmitted from speech until it was finally all placed in writing. Today, and so you see that also with like the Vedas and the early era of Judaism, even the very early portion of Islam, waited until these scriptures and revelations could be set down in a written form. And so that's also seen in the early history of Buddhism. It took 5 centuries until the canon was transmitted into a written form. Today, all these doctrines are found in written forms, but the oral tradition of memorization and speech, teaching it that way and learning it that way, still holds great importance even to the current day. Since the early history of Buddhism, since it had no written texts, the religion has no single body of scriptures, unlike, say, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which have like a single Bible, which is a closed canon that cannot be added to any longer. But that's different in Buddhism. There's no single authoritative body of scripture that all Buddhists rely on across all sects and denominations. And some of the canons are not totally closed either, meaning that they can still be added into. Different branches of Buddhism hold different sacred texts to be the most central or important. So in Buddhism, there are many ways to convey the dharma of the religion, which is its essential laws, practices, and truths. Perhaps the oldest and most strict body of Buddhist writings are the texts used in the Theravada tradition, which are called the Tipitaka, which translates to the 3 baskets. Okay, so here we go. Okay, so the Tipitaka is a sacred Buddhist text of Theravada Buddhism, and the word itself, in its literal translation, means 3 baskets. They're written in an old Indian language called Pali. So Pali is an old Indian language, and the 3 baskets, the Tipitaka, is written in Pali. It's somewhat similar to Sanskrit, so it's kind of a offshoot of the Sanskrit language. These writings are sometimes referred to simply as the Pali Canon. So Pali Canon, in reference to the language that these canonical writings are placed in. It's said to have been written in about 29 BCE. So it was written in about 29 BCE under King Vadagami of Sri Lanka. The 3 quote-unquote baskets refer to the 3 sections of the canon. So here are the 3 of those baskets, or so-called. 1, the Sutra Pitaka. 2, the Vinaya Pitaka. And 3, Abhidharma Pitaka. Yeah. So those are the 3 so-called baskets. The Sutra basket, the first one, contains the Buddha's speeches as well as poems and narratives about his previous lives. It also has some writings from some of his earliest followers, including what's called Verses of the Male Elders. This is from his oldest male followers, and Verses of the Female Elders, which is a collection of written ideas from his earliest female following. The Vinaya Pitaka, the second basket, focuses on rules of discipline, including a section called monastic precepts, which is supposed to instruct monks and nuns of the Buddhist tradition in how they're supposed to live their lives and what rules they should follow. It also has stories that show the moral principles of Buddhism. And the Abhidharma, the third basket, places in specific categories each aspect of Buddhist thought. So it kind of tries to provide a precise organization of all the ideas into distinct categories. The interpretation of this Pali canon is largely influenced by a monk named Buddhaghosa, who came to Sri Lanka from India in the 5th century ACE. So Buddhaghosa, I just put some info about him there in the chat text box. He's a 5th century ACE, meaning after the Common Era, monk who came from India to Sri Lanka, and he helped to establish and to interpret this Pali canon. He both collected and transmitted a lot of commentaries on the Pali texts as well. So his collected commentaries and writings are seen as an authoritative guide to the Pali canon and to Theravada Buddhism. So he gets a historical recognition for that role. Chinese and Tibetan Buddhists have a different canon with literature written later than the Pali canon of Theravada Buddhists, as late as the 12th century. So the canon followed by Mahayana Buddhists of China and the Tibetan Buddhists of Tantric Buddhists of Tibet, they have a different canon. Let's see here. Writings in the Buddhist canon vary from sect to sect, and they're sometimes still being added to, unlike the Christian Bible or Quran, which are closed and can't be added to any longer. Despite these differences, the writings are still revered with respect and authority, both because they reveal the Buddha's teachings, but also because it connects the followers to him. So these teachings and writings that have survived through the generations, as mentioned in the previous lecture, Buddhists consider these writings themselves to be kind of an extension of the Buddha's body itself. They sometimes refer to it as his Dharma body. It is his continuing presence in the world, and it's therefore as respected as the Buddha himself, since in a way it is him and it is his continuing presence in the world. As it says on page 179, while Buddhist canonical literature is variable and new texts have often been added, it is still considered a source of authority, not only because it provides a record of the Buddha's teaching, but also because it provides access, in a sense, to the Buddha himself. Buddhist sacred texts represent the most important enduring aspects of the Buddha, what Buddhists refer to as his Dharma body. A line in the Pali canon says, "What is there in seeing this vile body? He who sees the Dharma sees me. He who sees me sees the Dharma." The Dharma functions as the continuing presence of the Buddha in the Buddhist community and is as worthy of respect as the Buddha himself. Okay. Now, the Mahayana Buddhist traditions are dated. The earliest writings in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition are dated to the 1st century BCE. And some of those writings were translated into Chinese starting in the 2nd century ACE. So now I'm talking about the development of the Mahayana Buddhist canon as opposed to the Theravada Pali canon. But the Mahayana canon continued to accumulate more writings well into the modern era, as late as the 12th century. The Mahayana canon is therefore not as fixed and formal as the Pali canon is, where in that case the Pali canon is closed long ago and it's highly regimented. But the Mahayana canon remained open for 1,000 years longer than that, and it's much more loose and disorganized in terms of what parts are more authoritative or focal. The earliest collection of Chinese Mahayana Buddhist writings dates from about 518 ACE. The Tibetan canon was collected by the medieval scholar Bustan, who lived from 1290. So let me give you his information. 1290 to 1364 ACE. And medieval Buddhist scholar who collected the Tibetan canon, and it was first printed in its entirety then later in Beijing in the 15th century. For both Chinese and Tibetan Buddhists, there's a much looser concept of an official canon. There's a core of authoritative sutras derived from Buddha and the Bodhisattvas, and around this core, various other philosophical writings and literature. One important section found in the sutra part of these canons, the more authoritative part, is a discussion about the perfection of wisdom. So, the perfection of wisdom, quote unquote, is an important section of the more authoritative part of the Mahayana canon of Buddhist writings. And what it states is the basic notion of the Bodhisattva ideal, but it also heavily emphasizes the concept of emptiness. So that writing emphasizes the Buddhist concept of emptiness. Different Mahayana cultures interpret the doctrine of emptiness differently. In Tibetan thought, the doctrine is thought to mean that all things are empty of identity, meaning that the existence of anything is only conventional. So, like, you may think, here's me and here's this hydro flask, and we're different things, and we have different identities. But if you believe this idea of emptiness as the Tibetans interpret it, it would be held that there's actually no strong, firm distinction between anything or anything else. If you really think about the universe metaphysically, you might think about how it's all made out of elementary particles, and these particles form different composite objects like tables, chairs, human beings, planets, stars, but that the ultimate arrangement of the particles is ever shifting and subject to change. So you might think that as much as we conventionally label an object this versus that there's no strong or robust difference between the different things, and that all things are kind of somehow morphing into one another over time. In Chinese thought, though, the doctrine of emptiness is interpreted slightly differently to mean that the mind is empty of any distinction between subject and object. So we often distinguish the subject, the person having the experience, from the objects that one thinks of. On this Chinese interpretation of the emptiness doctrine, would mean that there's no such difference, that it's only an illusion that there's a difference between, say, the self and the other. So, that you're more connected with the rest of reality than you may think, or that your identity is not as distinct from the things around you as you may have thought. So that's an interesting and important concept that a lot of Buddhists emphasize. It's supposed to help facilitate your progress towards enlightenment when you lose the attachment to this robust notion of self, or this robust notion that there's discrete entities in the world with specifically different identities. Tantric Buddhists have a collection of texts from the Tibetan canon of Buddhist literature. And these texts, like those of the other canons, include a variety of material from songs of tantric saints to commentary on tantric rituals, symbols, and meditative practices. The Tibetan tradition classifies these tantric writings into 4 categories. So 4 categories of tantric Buddhist writings. So first, you have ritual, the ritual category, meditative and devotional practices. The second is practice. The second category is practice, which talks about lifestyle, rules of the monastery and the lay people. The third talks about discipline. That's the third category of writings in the Tantric Buddhist tradition, how to achieve the path to liberation. And the fourth is known by the phrase highest discipline. That's supposed to talk about the focusing on the realization of emptiness that we were just talking about. So they're classified by topic. The Tantric literature grew and evolved in India between the 7th and the 12th centuries ACE. A few other notable texts are the Mahayana collection called the Ratnakuta, which translates to the phrase heap of jewels. And the Ranakuta, heap of jewels, another Mahayana text. It contains the writings that inspire the Mahayana tradition of devotion to the Buddha Amitabha, which means infinite light. We talked about Amitabha earlier in connection with the Pure Land sect of Buddhism, and the origin stories of that figure are found in this Ratnakuta text. There's also the Lotus Sutra, another sacred text of Mahayana Buddhism. Lotus Sutra, just to give you the name there in the chat. That is a thorough summary of many different Mahayana doctrines that has had great influence and impact on East Asian nations where Buddhism flourishes. Within the Lotus Sutra, there's this famous parable where the Buddha is shown in the image of a father who rescues children from a burning house by promising them different vehicles. So he like lures them out of the burning house by saying, "Come here, and if you just come out, I'll give you a quote unquote vehicle." But once outside, all the children are outside, he gives all of them one vehicle, which is supposed to be symbolic of the great vehicle of Mahayana. Mahayana actually means greater vehicle in its earliest etymological translation. And that's supposed to mean that it's this great vehicle that can convey a person on the path towards their ultimate destination of enlightenment. So this little parable or story in the Lotus Sutra is supposed to indicate the superiority of the Mahayana school in their view, as opposed to lesser schools from the earlier traditions of Buddhism. Now, since there are so many different Buddhist scriptures with varying degrees of importance, as you've seen, I've listed so many different ones, whether it's in the Tibetan tradition, the broader Mahayana tradition, or the Theravada tradition, the Pali Canon. Since there are so many different Buddhist scriptures with varying degrees of importance to different schools of thought, there have sometimes been disagreements and conflicts over which one bears more central authority. Some Theravada Buddhists deny that Mahayana writings lack validity because they're not the Buddha's literal teachings. They're not like accounts and stories of the Buddha's own life in every case. So the Theravadas believe that because theirs are older and maybe more rooted in the original events of Buddha and his life, that they have greater authority. But some Mahayana reply back that their texts were merely, that the Theravada canon was merely preparation given by the Buddha for full development of the religion, which the Mahayana completed. So they have their different views about whether, one body of scriptures is more authoritative or focal than the other. So anyway, now we've discussed the important sacred texts of Buddhism. We're ready to move on to our next topic, which is just a brief discussion of sacred, or at least notable and revered persons of the religion. So as you guys have learned, there's no such thing in Buddhism strictly as an absolute divine figure. There's just human beings that achieve enlightenment, some of them that remain in the celestial realm, at least according to Mahayana Buddhists, that assist people on their progress towards their own enlightenment. But the closest there are to sacred persons in Buddhism are just those that live a life like the Buddha did with the same principles. This means that you have to go on a quest for enlightenment like the Buddha did to achieve enlightenment. And if you attain that status, then you could become one of these highly recognized and revered figures of the religion. Some of the most celebrated examples of such people are the earliest followers of the Buddha. So let me tell you about some of those. One is his chief disciple, Shariputra. Shariputra, chief disciple of the Buddha, his main follower at the beginning. He was born into a high Brahmin caste in India, the highest caste, which is filled with priests and teachers. He was converted by the Buddha to Buddhism from Hinduism, and he also achieved enlightenment. He is said in the legends to be the first one to have asked the Buddha a question. Converted to Buddhism at the same time as him was Madhyayana. That spelling correctly for you guys, Madhyayana. This is just another one of the early followers of Buddha that was converted at the same time as Shariputra. He was also born from a Brahmin family. And according to legends, they say legendary stories that he had magical powers, enabling him to control various forces of nature. Another unique figure in this early follower list was Angulimala. There's an interesting story behind his identity, and his name kind of translates to garland of fingers for a specific reason that I'll mention. So this man is supposed to represent how Buddhist practices and beliefs can transform a person completely, because according to the stories, before he met the Buddha, he was a murderer who was so brutal that he would wear his victims' fingers for a necklace, hence the name Garland of Fingers. But yet, after converting to Buddhism, he becomes a monk and reaches enlightenment, showing that Buddhism can radically transform anyone's life or destiny, even if they had a really bad record or pattern of behavior before they encountered Buddhist thought. Some important monks in later centuries were also celebrated for their roles in the religion's history. The Mahayana philosopher from Bengal, Shantarakshita, helped found the first monastery in Tibet. Shantarakshita was a Mahayana philosopher and Buddhist from Bengal. He helped found the first monastery in Tibet. Buddhist monks also helped to develop and spread Buddhism to East and Southeast Asia. For example, Buddhaghosa, who we referred to earlier, an Indian monk, helped develop Buddhism in Sri Lanka. In China, a couple of important Buddhist monk figures. Shenju and Huineng. They found the northern and southern schools of Chan Buddhism in China, respectively. So Shenju founds northern Chan, and Huineng founds the southern school of Chan Buddhism in China. The Japanese monk Dogen Dogen is a Japanese Buddhist monk who develops the classical form of Zen Buddhism, which is the sort of corollary to Chan Buddhism in Chinese culture. And many people revere the current Dalai Lama as the best living example of the Buddhist ideal. Lama is the Tibetan word for teacher. Dalai Lama actually, therefore, literally means ocean teacher. The ocean of wisdom and human thought is sort of a metaphor, and he's a teacher that's supposed to help reveal all that to you. The Buddha said that men or women could be monks or nuns, even though today there are not as many female orders. Nonetheless, some still do exist in China and a couple of other places. It should also be noted that the Mahayana believe that even lay people, that means ordinary people that are not monks or nuns, can attain Buddhahood. There are Mahayana sutras that talk about lay bodhisattvas. Vimalakirti is one of them. Vimalakirti is a lay bodhisattva, meaning that this is a person that achieved the same celestial bodhisattva status, but not having been a monk, just practicing Buddhist principles in their everyday life. And the idea of these everyday bodhisattvas appeals to especially Chinese Mahayana culture, which emphasizes devotion to family, which is somewhat inconsistent with taking on the solitary life of a monk. In the Tantric tradition, one who isolates from society and achieves enlightenment either alone or maybe with just one personal guru is known as a Siddha, which is a Tantric saint in Buddhism. So they live a more solitary life, and that contrasts with the Mahayana ideal of the enlightened bodhisattva that returns to the world to help others. Indeed, there have been some Mahayana Buddhist princes and kings who some revere as bodhisattvas as well. So now we've come to the end of our discussion of sacred persons, and so we will finish up by reviewing the all-important ethical principles that lie at the heart of the Buddhist belief system. So, ethical principles. There's a famous story from the Buddha's life that kind of many people say captures the essence of Buddhist ethics. In the story, a man approaches the Buddha and says that he will not listen to his teachings until the Buddha can answer specific esoteric questions. For example, how was the world created? And will the soul exist after death? In reply, the Buddha says to the man that asking me these questions and wanting me to answer them is kind of like being a man who has just been shot with a poisoned arrow, but refuses to remove it until we can answer detailed questions like, what is this arrow made of? And who shot the arrow? And why did they shoot it? Obviously, the most important thing in the first place is to just get it out and to stop the poison from, spreading throughout the body. So the lesson of the parable or story is to remind us that in Buddhism, everything is directed towards the attainment of enlightenment. There's no value to these metaphysical, esoteric, abstruse questions like about the origins of the universe or so on, unless they help to serve as a means to attaining enlightenment. In metaphorical terms, all that matters is whatever helps one remove the quote unquote arrow of suffering. Anything that delays or interferes with that is not considered valuable. And they say you can escape this suffering by attaining enlightenment, sometimes called nirvana, which frees you from the cycle of life, death, and reincarnation. To attain enlightenment, they say to follow the Noble Eightfold Path. And the Eightfold Path is a way of ordering your life and applying principles to your thoughts and actions. So here are the 8 parts of the Eightfold Path. You want to make that progress towards enlightenment. Here are the steps or pathways. So there's right understanding, having a correct and proper understanding of things and the world. There's right thought, having good thoughts, not malicious, harmful, or overly greedy and desirous thoughts. There's right speech. So thought leads to speech. We should have the right words. We should measure our words and speak carefully, thinking before we do so. There's right action, always applying proper principles of conduct to your behavior. There's right livelihood, meaning that the thing that you do for your work and for your income should be something rewarding that doesn't beat you down or make your life worse. Sorry, just getting this here in the box. Right livelihood, right effort, trying, giving your best for the things that matter most. Right mindfulness, so not going through life unconsciously or unaware of the surrounding details of what's happening and what you're doing, but always being sensitive and attuned to that. And finally, right concentration. Right concentration, which some call disciplined mind. Some people summarize these principles into a more narrow 3. And so 3 main principles that stand behind the Eightfold Path. Number 1, avoid harmful conduct. Don't seek to harm either others or yourself or the world. Disciplined mind, which is similar to the right concentration principle above. That helps you to remove the desires and passions that cause harmful actions, and then proper understanding. So whether understood in terms of the Eightfold Path or these 3 major principles, a person is supposed to apply this concept to their behavior in life and to their thoughts as a way of making progress towards their ultimate enlightenment. These ideas, especially the 3 principles listed just now, they kind of work together with the concept of karma, because the idea is that harmful actions will bring punishments to you, so you don't want to do harmful actions. That's why number 1 is avoid harmful conduct. When these punishments get brought about to you because of your bad karma, that will make it even harder to attain enlightenment, because you'll be dealing with all these setbacks and difficulties that bring about more desires. A disciplined mind helps you remove the desires and passions that cause harmful behavior, and proper wisdom eliminates the false sense of self and attachment that causes all those desires in the first place. Um, Buddhists believe in essentially the same karmic principles as Hindus, showing again their common Indian origins. So we've talked about karma, and Buddhists believe just as much as Hindus in that concept. In Buddhist communities, monks rely on the lay people to donate them a daily meal. So they will just literally walk through the community holding out an offering bowl and receive food from the patronage of the lay people. And this is supposed to help those lay people by giving them a chance to build positive karma, helping them to make more progress towards enlightenment. People should likewise avoid anger, cruelty, hatred, and violence for the same reason, because it's going to do harm to your karmic balance and perpetuate the cycle of life and death for longer, which you want to escape. The Buddha is said to be an ideal example of such righteous conduct, both in his incarnation as the Buddha, as Siddhartha Gautama, but also in his previous lives, according to the tradition. Mental concentration or a disciplined mind can take a variety of forms. But as with certain forms of yoga practice, one way to do it is through physical postures and a concentration. For example, sitting with the back straight, legs crossed, feeling stable, and focusing on your breathing in a silent state of meditation. This and similar meditative practices produce mindfulness and calms the mind, lessening negative emotions and making you more tuned to the connection between yourself and the rest of the universe. Some people also try to concentrate or meditate on a specific image, like the mandala or an image of a Buddha. Wisdom is acquired, in the Theravada view, by studying the Pali Canon and the doctrine of no self. The no self doctrine means that you become aware of a deep truth that we do not endure across time. And knowing this is supposed to free you from selfish attachments. I find the doctrine of no self within Buddhism interesting and philosophically very rich. I mean, many of you may have heard certain facts about how, physically speaking, no cell within our body is the same over a span of, say, 7 years, as all the physical parts have been replaced. So you watching this video don't have any physical identity to a photo of you from, say, 10 years ago, but yet you're still the same person. Buddhists are more comfortable saying that actually there's no strict identity that persists across time. And it is your attachment to the idea of the self that gives you so many desires that stands in the way ultimately of your final enlightenment and, escape from the cycle of life and death and rebirth. Anyway, Theravada Buddhists also sometimes simply state their ethics as a set of 5 precepts. So in the Theravada tradition, the pathway to your enlightenment and the required ethical principles that you should live by are expressed not in the Eightfold Path. Well, they also revere the Eightfold Path and the 3 main principles, but another way of articulating the same is what's called the 5 precepts. So the 5 precepts of Theravada Buddhism. So here they are. 1, no killing. So they're kind of almost like commandments, as we've seen in the 10 Commandments from the Abrahamic tradition. No killing, no stealing, no abusive sexual conduct, no lying. And then the 5th precept is no intoxicating beverages. So to Theravada Buddhists, these are requirements of a moral and ethical life. Finally, many in the Mahayana lands of North and East Asia profess to live according to the ideal of the Bodhisattva. The Bodhisattva ideal refers to the way the Bodhisattva lives by 2 main virtues. Okay, so compassion and wisdom. You must live your life according to those virtues if you want to live in the spirit and pattern of conduct as the Bodhisattvas do. They live according to the supreme values and virtues of compassion and wisdom. These values are expressed in the Bodhisattva vow. So, interesting concept is the Bodhisattva vow. And here's what it says. It says, "May I attain Buddhahood for the sake of all other beings." So that simple statement is the vow of the Bodhisattva. May I attain Buddhahood for the sake of all other beings. And within it, it kind of encapsulates those two major virtues: compassion, because you want to do this for everyone else's sake. You care about them and you want to help them. So that's compassionate behavior. The wisdom is to attain your own Buddhahood. So you want to attain this wise and deeply reflective inner sense of knowledge that gives you Buddhahood, but the reason you're doing it is not merely for your own sake, but out of compassion for others, and to pass that along to others and assist them. So again, compassion is to try and relieve the suffering of others and help them reach their enlightenment, even if it comes at your own expense, even if the process of helping other people towards their enlightenment delays your own. And wisdom is, again, to see through the veil of illusion that brings such attachment to the concept of the self and the desires of the self that sometimes trap us and constrain us into this perpetual cycle of life, death, and rebirth, which they construe as suffering. So guys, here we've had yet another installment of our lecture series. This one's run only about an hour long, so maybe a little less time, but a lot of important information in there. When we come back next time, we'll wrap up by having our third and final discussion of Buddhism. And then after that, in the next lecture unit to follow, we'll start talking about the Chinese traditions of world religion. So I want to thank you guys again for tuning in and watching. Please continue to follow the lecture series and all the class announcements. But for now, take care. It's been great, and I'll see you guys soon. Okay, thank you so much.